On the Route 9, Southern Laos Front, February 1971, artillery shells rained down relentlessly on the hilltops along the line of advance. Amid clouds of smoke and flying debris, ARVN units defending fire support bases west of the Vietnam-Laos border began reporting the appearance of enemy tanks. T-54S and PT-76S pushed through dense jungle, coordinating with infantry and long-range artillery. Many soldiers at that moment understood that the operation they had joined was no longer a limited incursion, but had become a fight for survival. But why did a campaign prepared with powerful U.S. fire support fall into a defensive posture? What strategic calculations failed to anticipate the opponent's response? And was the setback on Route 9, Southern Laos, merely the result of battlefield developments, or did it also stem from flawed decisions made at the planning level? From the very beginning. In 1969, President Richard Nixon's administration announced the policy of Vietnamization, a gradual withdrawal of U.S. ground forces from South Vietnam, while transferring primary combat responsibilities to the Army of the Republic of Nua, Vietnam, ARVN. However, Washington retained critical advantages: air power, logistics, military advisors, and long-range fire support. In the calculations of the Pentagon, Lam Son 719 was not merely a cross-border incursion. It was also a test of ARVN's ability to conduct large-scale independent operations at a time when American ground involvement was steadily decreasing. If successful, the campaign would demonstrate that South Vietnamese forces could shoulder major offensives on their own, reinforcing the political argument for continued U.S. troop withdrawals. The objective was Chepon, Sapon, a key logistical hub along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The plan relied on an advance along Route 9, the establishment of fire support bases on dominant high ground, and the use of U.S. air superiority to suppress enemy air defenses and clear the way for ground forces to sever supply lines. Yet the rugged jungle terrain, the extended lines of communication, and the dense network of opposing air defenses quickly shifted the balance. When accurate artillery barrages and armored units of the People's Army began to appear, the operation ceased to be a limited incursion. It evolved into a large-scale confrontation, placing the participating forces at growing risk of encirclement. At approximately 6:55 a.m., on the 8th of February, 1971, forward elements of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, officially crossed the Vietnam-Laos border in the Lao Bar sector, advancing into southern Laos along Route 9. The main striking force on the primary axis was the 1st Armored Brigade, with M41 tanks leading the column, followed by M113 armored personnel carriers, transporting mechanized infantry from the 1st Infantry Division. The marching formation was extended into separate tactical groupings to avoid presenting concentrated targets for enemy artillery. At the same time, from 7 until nearly noon on February 8, US CH-53 and UH-1 helicopter squadrons conducted dozens of air assault lifts onto high ground on both sides of Route 9. Airborne and Ranger battalions were tasked with seizing key elevations overlooking the valley and establishing fire support bases, FSBs, 105mm and 155mm artillery pieces were airlifted into position on the first day. According to logistical reports, hundreds of helicopter sorties, transport and support missions combined were flown on February 8th alone to maintain the tempo of deployment. Before infantry and armored units pushed deeper, the U.S. Air Force launched preparatory strikes beginning at dawn. F-4 Phantom and A-1 Skyraider aircraft targeted suspected storage sites and logistical routes of the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN. B-52 bombers were assigned to conduct saturation strikes on designated coordinates west of Barn Dung. By the end of February 9, operational maps showed a chain of fire support bases stretching along Route 9, forming a layered defensive network to secure ARVN's line of advance. However, from February 10 onward, difficulties began to emerge more clearly. The terrain of southern Laos, dense, multi-canopy jungle, hills divided by narrow valleys and small rivers, restricted aerial observation and target designation. Sections of Route 9 had been damaged by earlier rains. The narrow, muddy road surface slowed the movement of M41 tanks and M113 carriers beyond planned timelines. The mechanized columns were forced to stretch into smaller detachments, creating gaps between groupings and exposing them to artillery fire or ambushes from the flanks. On February 10 and 11, PAVN began to intensify its artillery bombardment. From approximately 5 a.m. until near midday on February 11, several forward fire support bases reported dozens to hundreds of 122 millimeters and 130 millimeters rounds striking helicopter landing zones and artillery positions. Some 105 millimeters guns sustained light damage, and certain landing zones were forced to suspend operations for hours. Several resupply flights were aborted during approach due to sustained ground fire. At the same time, PAVN's air defense network was deployed in depth along valleys and hillsides. Heavy machine guns, 12.7 millimeters, 23 millimeters, anti-aircraft guns, and in some sectors, 37 millimeters. Batteries were concealed beneath dense jungle canopy. UH-1 and CH-53 helicopters, descending to extract troops or deliver artillery pieces, frequently encountered direct fire. A number of aircraft were hit and compelled to return to base with significant damage. By February 12 and 13, ARVN and U.S. battlefield intelligence detected the movement of multiple main force PAVN units toward the Barn Dong and Chepone sectors. Rather than withdrawing under sustained airstrikes, PAVN infantry divisions, supported by artillery regiments and armored units, were redeployed into the area of operations. Blocking forces and layered defensive positions began to appear along both flanks of Route 9. The tactical situation gradually shifted from localized engagements to the encirclement of individual ARVN fire support bases. From mid-February onward, combat escalated in intensity. PAVN artillery fire was no longer limited to harassment. Barrages lasted for hours, particularly at night. Several Western fire support bases entered a state of relative isolation as ground routes were interdicted by mines and anti-tank fire. Interspersed with artillery bombardments were probing infantry assaults designed to test weak points in the defensive perimeter. On the morning of February 17, forward reports confirmed the presence of T-54 and PT-76 tanks along several approach routes. When these armored vehicles coordinated with infantry and artillery, the character of the fighting changed markedly. ARVN defensive units, organized primarily for rapid maneuver and air assault operations, faced heavier firepower than anticipated, under conditions where fortifications had already been weakened by continuous shelling. In the days that followed, deteriorating weather further constrained U.S. air operations. Morning fog and intermittent rain forced many support missions to fly at higher altitudes beyond direct visual acquisition, or to be canceled altogether. With temporary reductions in air superiority, ARVN fire support bases had to rely increasingly on organic artillery and small arms fire for defense. Supply lines, almost entirely dependent on helicopter lift, revealed their vulnerability under the dense and persistent anti-aircraft fire of PAVN forces. By late February 1971, the initial momentum of the offensive could no longer be sustained. Instead of continuing to expand control toward Chepone as originally planned, ARVN units were forced to concentrate on holding the positions they had already secured and ensuring the safety of their eastward lines of maneuver. The battlefield situation gradually shifted from a limited objective offensive into a large-scale confrontation, in which each fire support base became a potentially decisive point capable of shaping the overall course of the campaign. From that point onward, the operation was no longer merely a test of ARVN's ground combat capability. It also became a practical examination of the U.S. strategy built upon air superiority in complex terrain against a well-organized and highly mobile opponent. Thus, developments at the Western fire support bases in the days that followed would determine the ultimate direction of Operation Lam Son 719. Beginning at dawn on the 18th of February, 1971, the intensity of artillery fire by the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, against ARVN fire support bases, FSBs, positioned deep west of Barn Dong, increased markedly. Between approximately 5:30 and 7 a.m., multiple barrages of 122 millimeters and 130 millimeters rounds struck helicopter landing zones, and 105 millimeters and 155 millimeters artillery positions at several FSBs. According to post-engagement reports, on the morning of February 18 alone, one base absorbed more than 200 incoming rounds within less than 4 hours, damaging defensive works and temporarily rendering its landing zone inoperable. However, following this high-intensity bombardment, PAVN did not immediately launch large-scale ground assaults. On February 19 and 20, the primary tactic observed was encirclement and interdiction of supply lines. Ground routes running eastward along Route 9 into the base areas were continuously harassed with anti-tank mines and anti-armor fire. ARVN, M100, and 13 columns and logistical trucks were forced to move at reduced speed, often employing lead vehicles to probe for mines. During the same period, PAVN air defense fire was densely positioned around helicopter landing zones. 12.7 millimeters heavy machine guns and 23 millimeters anti-aircraft guns were concealed within nearby tree lines, engaging UH-1 and CH-53 helicopters during approach. Several resupply and medical evacuation missions were either aborted or required to reduce ammunition and fuel loads after sustaining hits while descending. Consolidated reports indicated that numerous helicopters supporting ARVN operations were damaged during this phase and had to return to eastern bases for repairs. On the morning of February 21, ARVN forward reports confirmed the first clear appearance of PAVN T-54 and PT-76 tanks along southwestern approaches to certain fire support bases. These vehicles were observed advancing in dispersed formations, exploiting valley terrain and dense jungle cover to avoid early detection from the air. By the early hours of February 22, at approximately 3:40 a.m., several fire support bases came under coordinated assault. The opening artillery barrage lasted roughly 45 minutes, concentrating on artillery positions and command areas. This was followed by ground attacks as PAVN infantry advanced toward the defensive perimeter under the cover of tanks and long-range artillery fire. Tanks were deployed in pairs or small groups, closing to short range at some points as near as 100 to 200 meters from ARVN defensive lines. Encircled on multiple sides, ARVN defenders, primarily airborne and mobile infantry units, responded with M72, LAW anti-tank weapons, recoilless rifles, and M2 heavy machine guns. However, because their positions had been subjected to sustained shelling beforehand, many fortifications and firing points had collapsed or been damaged, reducing the effectiveness of resistance. Several PAVN tanks were reportedly disabled, yet the pressure of the assault was maintained for hours. From the 23rd of February 1971, following earlier intense bombardments, the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, increased the tempo of ground attacks against ARVN-held fire support bases west of Barn Dong. At approximately 4:20 a.m. on February 23, several bases were struck by 122 millimeters and 130 millimeters artillery for nearly an hour. 105 millimeters artillery positions and command bunkers were hit repeatedly, and some shelters partially collapsed. After the barrage, PAVN infantry launched probing attacks from the southwest and south, using vegetation and low ground for concealment as they approached the defensive wire. ARVN forces responded with M2 heavy machine guns, M60 medium machine guns, and nighttime illumination rounds. Anti-tank teams employed M72 LAW rockets against suspected concentrations of armor or infantry. Fighting continued intermittently throughout the morning. However, PAVN did not initiate a full-scale assault that day, instead sustaining pressure through harassment fire. In the early hours of February 24, at approximately 3:35 a.m., a second preparatory barrage began. Within 40 to 50 minutes, hundreds of artillery rounds fell on helicopter landing zones and ARVN artillery emplacements. Immediately afterward, PAVN infantry advanced toward the perimeter from the northwest, while T-54 and PT-76 tanks appeared along the southern flank. The tanks advanced in groups of 2 to 3 vehicles, maintaining separation to avoid being destroyed simultaneously. Some halted at a distance of roughly 300 meters, using their main guns to fire directly at bunkers and defensive works, while infantry followed closely behind, exploiting tank fire to close in on the wire. ARVN units organized immediate countermeasures. Anti-tank teams maneuvered between fortifications, employing M72 law rockets against tanks at ranges under 100 meters. Several PAVN tanks were reportedly damaged or forced to withdraw. Nevertheless, because defensive works had been weakened by prior shelling, sections of the perimeter were breached, and at certain moments, PAVN infantry penetrated the outer defensive zone of the base. U.S. air support was requested urgently, but dense morning fog forced many A-1 and F-4 aircraft to operate at higher altitudes, preventing close air support from striking near the defensive lines as effectively as on previous days. The engagement lasted for hours, with casualties reported on both sides. On the morning of February 25, artillery bombardment continued at high intensity. From 5 until approximately 7:30 a.m., repeated volleys of 122 millimeters and 130 millimeters rounds struck the central areas of the base. Several ARVN 105 millimeters artillery pieces were destroyed or rendered inoperable due to damaged sighting systems. Shortly after 8, PAVN launched a larger coordinated assault. Tanks advanced to within close range of the defensive perimeter, some reportedly approaching to within 100 meters of ARVN positions. PAVN infantry attacked in short waves, attempting to seize machine gun nests and fortifications that had already been weakened or collapsed under earlier shelling. With artillery ammunition running low and air support unable to operate effectively due to poor weather, ARVN defenders were forced to contract their lines toward the central sector of the base. After hours of resistance, several positions were overrun. Remaining forces were ordered to destroy equipment that could not be evacuated, including artillery pieces, damaged vehicles, and remaining ammunition stockpiles before withdrawing in small groups toward the east. Simultaneously, along Route 9, ARVN M113, armored personnel carriers, and logistical convoys were repeatedly ambushed. PAVN forces positioned recoilless rifles and anti-tank weapons at both ends of road segments, targeting lead and rear vehicles to split the column. Following the initial volleys, infantry units opened fire from both hillsides, aiming to create confusion and force the convoy to halt. ARVN units responded with heavy machine gun fire, mounted on M113s, and called for artillery support from bases to the east to suppress suspected enemy positions. However, relief and maneuver operations were hindered by deteriorated road conditions and the persistent threat of anti-tank mines. By the end of the third week of February, 1971, after 3 consecutive days of high-intensity combat, the operational initiative had clearly diminished. Western fire support bases, once serving as launching points for offensive operations, had become encircled defensive positions. Along Route 9, ARVN mechanized formations were compelled to fight while withdrawing, under sustained and continuous enemy fire. By early March 1971, when the objective of securing lasting control over the Chepone area had not been achieved, and Western fire support bases continued to face sustained threats from artillery and armored attacks, the ARVN Campaign Command, coordinating with U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, decided to transition to an organized withdrawal along Route 9 toward the east. On the morning of March 6, beginning at approximately 7:30 a.m., forward elements commenced their departure from the Bairn Dung area. The withdrawal formation was structured in multiple security layers. The 1st Armored Brigade, with M41 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers, spearheaded the route clearance. Following them were airborne battalions, ranger units, and elements of the 1st Infantry Division, ARVN. Marine units were positioned on key high ground and critical junctions to serve as rearguard forces. U.S. air assets provided fire support, reconnaissance, and aerial transport using UH-1 and CH-53 helicopters, as well as fixed-wing strike aircraft. On March 6 itself, from approximately 9 a.m. until midday, PAVN artillery began targeting the withdrawal corridor. 122mm and 130mm rounds struck several helicopter landing zones and temporary mechanized assembly points west of Route 9. ARVN convoys were forced to halt and disperse to avoid concentrated targeting, slowing the pace of withdrawal beyond initial projections. On March 7 and 8, the intensity of shelling increased. From early morning around 5:30 until nearly 11 a.m., multiple temporary bases and technical halt points of ARVN units sustained dozens to hundreds of incoming artillery rounds. PAVN simultaneously employed 12.7mm heavy machine guns and anti-aircraft artillery positioned along valley slopes to interdict transport helicopters. In mid-morning on March 8, a U.S. UH-1 helicopter conducting a medical evacuation mission west of Route 9 was struck by 12.7mm fire from a hillside position. The aircraft lost altitude and was forced to execute an emergency landing in an open clearing while fighting continued nearby. ARVN infantry units immediately deployed a perimeter security formation, using M60 and M2 machine guns to return fire towards suspected anti-aircraft positions as they awaited another helicopter to extract the crew and wounded personnel. The area continued to receive intermittent harassing artillery fire for several hours afterward. From March 9 to 12, PAVN shifted to larger-scale ambush tactics along the withdrawal route. At narrow road segments, sharp bends, and densely forested stretches on both sides of Route 9, recoilless rifles and anti-tank weapons were pre-positioned to strike lead and rear vehicles, aiming to split ARVN mechanized columns. Once the convoy was forced to halt, PAVN infantry opened fire from both hillsides with AK rifles and light machine guns, maintaining continuous pressure. Several ARVN M100 and 13 armored personnel carriers and logistical trucks were hit, forcing them out of formation or leaving them abandoned along the roadside. ARVN units responded with heavy machine gun fire, mounted on M113s, employed M72 law rockets against suspected anti-tank positions, and requested immediate U.S. airstrikes along the enemy's firing line. A 1 Skyraider and F-4 Phantom aircraft flew multiple sorties, dropping bombs and firing rockets close to the roadway to relieve pressure. However, because opposing forces were dispersed and well concealed under dense jungle canopy, completely eliminating the ambush positions proved difficult. By mid-March 1971, the withdrawal was being conducted under conditions of constant movement and sustained combat. Route 9 had become a contested battlefield, where ARVN formations advanced in short segments under artillery fire, anti-aircraft engagement, and repeated ambushes, while U.S. air power attempted to maintain a protective corridor to ensure the safe movement of forces back toward the eastern border. On March 10 and 11, 1971, as ARVN withdrawal columns continued maneuvering eastward along Route 9, PAVN anti-aircraft fire intensified markedly. From approximately 6 a.m. on March 10, as UH-1 and CH-53 helicopter formations descended toward temporary landing zones, 12.7mm heavy machine guns and 23mm anti-aircraft guns, concealed beneath jungle canopy along both sides of the valley, opened fire in coordinated bursts. By midday, multiple flights were forced to abort their missions or return to base with fuselages and rotor assemblies damaged by incoming rounds. On the morning of March 11, at approximately 7:15 a.m., as a flight of CH-53 helicopters approached a pickup zone near a hilltop south of Route 9, dense 23mm and 37mm anti-aircraft fire erupted. Several helicopters were hit while hovering in preparation to land. One aircraft was forced to make an emergency descent into a nearby clearing, while ARVN ground units deployed a perimeter defense using M60 medium machine guns and M2 heavy machine guns to return fire towards suspected anti-aircraft positions. Over the course of these 2 days, numerous helicopters sustained heavy damage. Several were shot down in the mountainous jungle terrain, resulting in additional personnel and equipment losses. On March 13, at approximately 4:10 a.m., near a fire support base to the east serving as a rear guard position, PAVN initiated an assault with a 122mm and 130mm artillery barrage, lasting nearly 40 minutes. The shelling concentrated on the command post, landing zone, and ARVN 105mm artillery emplacements. Around 5, as the bombardment subsided, T-54 and PT-76 tanks advanced from the northwest and south, coordinating with infantry in an attack against the defensive perimeter. The tanks moved in groups of 2 to 3 vehicles, exploiting smoke and low terrain to close in. Some halted at distances of approximately 200 to 300 meters to deliver direct fire against bunkers and fortifications. PAVN infantry followed closely behind, attempting to widen breaches in sections of defensive wire already damaged by artillery. ARVN forces responded with M72 Law anti-tank rockets and recoilless rifles at close range, sometimes under 100 meters. Several PAVN tanks were disabled or halted on the battlefield, but the remaining vehicles maintained the pressure. The engagement continued for hours, with sustained exchanges of fire on both sides, before gradually diminishing toward late morning as direct contact temporarily eased. From March 14 to 16, heavy fighting persisted at multiple points along the withdrawal corridor. By day, PAVN employed 122mm and 130mm artillery to suppress temporary assembly areas and helicopter landing zones. By night, infantry units conducted deep thrusts aimed at isolating individual ARVN elements. Several stretches of Route 9 were interdicted, while mechanized columns were in motion. ARVN forces relied on heavy machine gun fire from M113S, artillery support from eastern positions, and repeated requests for U.S. airstrikes. U.S. air operations intensified, with A-1 Skyraider and F-4 Phantom aircraft striking suspected PAVN concentrations, while B-52 bombers continued scheduled strikes on designated coordinates. However, poor morning weather and dense anti-aircraft fire forced many aircraft to operate at higher altitudes or conduct attacks beyond direct visual coordination with ground forces, reducing the effectiveness of close air support during the most intense phases of combat. From March 17 to 20, aerial losses increased noticeably. Medical evacuation and resupply helicopters were frequently engaged as soon as they descended toward landing zones. In some instances, helicopters were hit while hovering, forcing crews to execute emergency landings in dense jungle terrain while fighting continued nearby. ARVN units had to establish outer defensive perimeters and hold their ground until additional aircraft or relief elements arrived to extract the crews and wounded. Post-campaign assessments indicated that U.S. and ARVN forces lost or sustained damage to hundreds of helicopters due to PAVN anti-aircraft fire. These losses reflected the intensity of the air-ground confrontation during the withdrawal phase, when Route 9 and temporary landing zones were consistently targeted and controlled by opposing artillery and air defense systems. In the final days before the complete withdrawal, ARVN, Marine, and airborne units assumed rearguard responsibilities near the border. PAVN continued probing attacks and artillery harassment, but did not launch a large-scale assault directly against the final withdrawal corridor. U.S. air operations intensified, with B-52 strikes conducted to create buffer zones along likely avenues of approach. By March 23 and 24, 1,971, the last ARVN units had crossed back over the border into South Vietnamese territory. Operation Lam Son, 719, officially came to a close. Although ARVN and U.S. authorities declared that significant damage had been inflicted on PAVN forces and logistical stockpiles, the strategic objective of permanently severing the Ho Chi Minh Trail supply network was not achieved. Losses in personnel, tanks, armored vehicles, and particularly helicopters among ARVN and U.S. forces were assessed as substantial, while PAVN retained its capacity for maneuver and logistical sustainment after the campaign. The operation thus concluded not merely with a withdrawal, but with a series of running engagements along Route 9, where air power and mechanized mobility confronted, at close range, sustained artillery, dense air defenses, and persistent close contact tactics employed by the opposing force. Looking back, its outcome did not emerge. The original ARVN fire support bases. At the same time, heavy reliance on air superiority and helicopter-based supply lines made the operational system inherently fragile. When adverse weather and dense anti-aircraft defenses restricted air support, ground units found themselves increasingly isolated, and the tempo and flexibility of the entire campaign declined markedly. Ultimately, the operation carried significance beyond its immediate military scope. Lam Son, 719, was widely regarded as a major test of the Vietnamization strategy, under which the United States reduced its direct ground presence and transferred primary combat responsibilities to ARVN. The actual course of events, with substantial losses in personnel, armored vehicles, and particularly helicopters, raised serious questions about the sustainability of military advantage as U.S. forces continued to withdraw. Although participating forces declared that significant damage had been inflicted on PAVN units and logistical infrastructure, the strategic objective of permanently severing the Ho Chi Minh Trail supply network was not achieved as anticipated. The life and death struggle along Route 9 inches southern Laos therefore represented not merely a series of intense engagements in difficult jungle terrain, but a strategic turning point in the broader conflict. It demonstrated how quickly the gap between planning assumptions and battlefield realities can widen when initial premises prove flawed. Within that gap, decisions shaped by strategic optimism, political pressure, or incomplete assessments of the adversary can produce consequences extending far beyond the scope of a single campaign.